At the riding the crest of the rock and roll wave and all of that, did you realize that there were people who actually thought that rock and roll was a communist plot to undermine the morals of America?
I never thought that much about it. They
Yeah.
cared less.
Yeah? You mean...
There are men who change history quietly, and then there are men who kick the door down, set the hallway on fire, and dare the world to say something about it. Jerry Lee Lewis was the second kind. From the moment he sat down at a piano, he wasn't performing. He was declaring war. Against the establishment, against the church, against every polished, well-behaved version of what American music was supposed to sound like. And for a while, he was winning. But here's the thing about men who burn that bright. The fire never stays contained to just the stage. Jerry Lee Lewis was born on September 29, 1935, in Faraday, Louisiana, a small, swampy, God-fearing town that somehow produced one of the most ungodly forces in the history of rock and roll. He came up poor, came up religious, and came up with a piano that felt less like an instrument and more like a weapon. By the time he walked into Sun Records in Memphis in 1956, he already carried the weight of a man twice his age. He had debts. He had sins. He had a hunger that no amount of success was ever going to fully satisfy. And Sam Phillips, the man who discovered Elvis, heard it immediately. He didn't just hear talent, he heard danger. And in 1957, he unleashed it on the world with whole lotta shaking going on. A record so raw, so physically aggressive, so unapologetically sexual, that radio stations refused to play it until the demand from listeners made refusing impossible. Jerry Lee Lewis didn't ask for permission. He never did. Then came Great Balls of Fire. Then came the hysteria. Then came the sold-out tours and the screaming crowds and the genuine, terrifying question of whether this man was going to overtake Elvis Presley as the defining figure of rock and roll. For one blazing moment, it looked like the answer might actually be yes, and then the world found out about his wife. In 1958, it was revealed that Jerry Lee Lewis had married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown, and that this was, quietly, his third marriage, with questions surrounding whether his previous marriages had even been legally dissolved. The backlash was instant and catastrophic. Venues canceled. Radio stations pulled his records. The British press, who had been prepared to welcome him as the next great American export, turned on him with a ferocity that shocked even the most seasoned people in the music industry. Almost overnight, one of the most powerful careers in American music was reduced to rubble. But what the world focused on, the marriage, the scandal, the headlines, was never really the full story. Because behind the tabloid chaos was something far more complicated. Jerry Lee Lewis was not simply a reckless man. He was a tormented one, raised in a Pentecostal household that preached hellfire with genuine conviction. He spent his entire life suspended between the devil's music that made him famous and the God he genuinely believed was keeping score. He talked about hell the way other men talk about the weather, like it was real, like it was close, like he could feel the heat of it on the back of his neck every single time he sat down to play. That tension never left him. Not through 7 marriages, not through the deaths of 2 of his sons, not through the decades of comeback attempts and faded glory and the long, brutal process of becoming a legend that people respected from a distance but no longer feared up close. The fire in Jerry Lee Lewis never went out, but it did turn inward. And the things it burned through in there, in the private rooms of his life that the cameras never reached, were the things that defined him far more than any hit record ever could. Here is what most people never sat with long enough to understand. Jerry Lee Lewis was a man of extraordinary secrets. Not the kind that come out in tell-all books or explosive interviews, but the quiet, buried kind. The kind that live in the gaps between what a man says and what he actually did. The kind that exist in the faces of people who share your blood but not your last name. The kind that survive long after the man himself is gone. He fathered children the world knew about. He fathered children the world didn't. He moved through the American South during an era when powerful men, especially powerful men in music, could leave entire pieces of themselves behind in places that no biographer ever thought to look. And most of the time, the world let them, because the world was more interested in the performance than the performer, more interested in the piano on fire than the man who lit the match. Jerry Lee Lewis died on October 28, 2022. He was 87 years old. And when he went, he took answers with him that most people didn't even know they should have been asking for. But some questions don't die with the man who holds them. Some answers are still out there, living quietly, singing in small churches, carrying a voice that has no business belonging to an ordinary person. Of all the secrets Jerry Lee Lewis carried across 8 decades of life, one of them had a name, and that name was Bob Joyce. Picture a Sunday morning in a small town in Arkansas. Nothing extraordinary about the building. Nothing remarkable about the congregation. Wooden pews, familiar faces, the kind of church that exists in 10,000 towns across the American South, ordinary in every way that a church can be ordinary. And then, the pastor opens his mouth, and the room changes. It's not just that the voice is good. Plenty of pastors have good voices. This is something different, something that doesn't belong in a modest Sunday service in a town most people have never heard of. This is a voice that feels like it was built in a different era, rich and rolling and devastatingly controlled, with a warmth that wraps around you before you even process what's happening. The kind of voice that makes people stop mid-thought. The kind that makes strangers turn to each other and ask the question without even finishing the sentence. Where does a voice like that come from? That is the question that turned Bob Joyce from a local pastor into a global obsession. It didn't happen in a concert hall. It didn't happen on a record label. It happened the way most things happen in the internet age. Someone filmed it, someone shared it, and then something extraordinary took place. People listened. And then they listened again. And then they sent it to someone else and said, "You need to hear this." Within a short period of time, videos of Bob Joyce singing had accumulated millions of views from people who had never set foot in Arkansas and never would. People who couldn't explain why they were watching a pastor sing in a church they'd never heard of, except that they simply could not stop. The comment sections filled up fast, and they all kept circling back to the same name. Elvis, Presley. The comparisons were immediate and they were everywhere. People weren't saying he reminded them of Elvis in the way that any strong baritone might trigger a loose association. They were saying the resemblance was uncanny, structural. Something in the tone, in the phrasing, in the way certain notes were held just a half second longer than expected. It felt less like imitation and more like inheritance, like something passed down rather than learned. Elvis fans who have spent decades listening to every recorded note the man ever made were stopping cold and saying they'd never heard anything outside of Elvis's catalog that hit them the same way in the chest. And so the theory was born. The Elvis theory, if you haven't encountered it, goes something like this. There is a belief held by a significant number of people that Elvis Presley did not actually die on August 16, 1977. That the death was staged. That Elvis, exhausted and suffocated by fame, chose to disappear rather than continue living a life that had become a kind of gilded prison. And in the years that followed, a small but devoted community of believers began looking for evidence of where he might have gone. When Bob Joyce emerged with that voice, that impossible era-defining voice, many of them became convinced they had found their answer. The theory spread. Articles were written. Videos were made dissecting his vocal patterns, frame by frame, note by note. People pointed to physical similarities, to mannerisms, to the way he moved when he sang. And Bob Joyce, for his part, responded with the patient grace of a man who had heard the question so many times it no longer surprised him, denying the connection, gently but clearly, and continuing to do exactly what he had always done: pastor his church, serve his congregation, and sing. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody saw coming. Because while the entire world was focused on the Elvis question, while every camera and every conspiracy thread and every comment section was pointed in that direction, they were standing directly next to a different question. A quieter one. A more dangerous one. One that doesn't require you to believe Elvis faked his death. One that doesn't require you to believe anything supernatural or impossible at all. One that only requires you to look at the actual history of American music and ask a question that is far more grounded and somehow far more unsettling. What if the real connection wasn't to Elvis Presley at all? What if the voice that stopped millions of people in their tracks wasn't pointing back to the king of rock and roll, but to the man who nearly became the king? The man who shared that same Sun Records Dina, that same Southern fire, that same era-defining sound? The man who came from that same swampy stretch of the American South and left pieces of himself scattered across it in ways that have never been fully accounted for? Bob Joyce didn't just sound like someone from that world. He sounded like someone who was born into it. Like someone for whom that sound wasn't a studied thing, it was a natural thing. An inherited thing. And when you start looking at what Jerry Lee Lewis's private life actually looked like, the timeline, the geography, the decades of unanswered questions about the children he fathered and the ones he never claimed, the connection between these two men starts to make a terrifying kind of sense. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed. And that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Every great mystery has a moment where the pieces stop feeling like coincidences, where the pattern becomes too specific, too precise, too relentlessly consistent to wave away with a shrug. This is that moment, because when you stop looking at Bob Joyce and Jerry Lee Lewis as two separate stories and start looking at them as potentially one story, the evidence doesn't just suggest a connection. It begins to demand an explanation. Start with the geography, because geography in a story like this is never just background detail. Jerry Lee Lewis was born and raised in Faraday, Louisiana, a small delta town sitting right on the border of Mississippi, deep in the kind of American South where family trees grow complicated and records grow thin. Bob Joyce's roots trace back to Arkansas, a state that sits in the same cultural and geographic orbit, separated from Lewis's home territory by the kind of distance that means nothing to a young man moving through the region in the late 1940s and early 1950s. This was the world before interstate highways made everything predictable. People moved. People wandered. Powerful men, especially men with the kind of magnetic pull that Jerry Lee Lewis possessed even before he was famous, left impressions in places that the official record never captured. And the official record of Jerry Lee Lewis's early personal life is, to put it plainly, full of gaps. His first marriage to Dorothy Barton in 1952 ended in divorce that was murky in its documentation. His second marriage to Jane Mitchum in 1953 overlapped with the first in ways that raised legal questions at the time and historical questions ever since. These were not the actions of a man who treated the formal documentation of his personal life as a priority. These were the actions of a man who moved fast, felt deeply, and left paperwork to sort itself out later. And in that kind of life, in that kind of era, in that kind of geography, children could arrive and depart from the official story without anyone in the wider world ever knowing they had existed at all. Now bring in the voice. Because this is where the argument stops being circumstantial and starts becoming something you can actually hear. There is a specific quality to Bob Joyce's voice that goes beyond range, beyond tone, beyond the kind of general vocal power that any talented singer might possess. Music analysts and vocal coaches who have studied recordings of Bob Joyce have pointed to something far more precise. A quality in the lower register, a particular way the voice breaks and recovers at moments of emotional intensity, a phrasing style that belongs to a very specific tradition. Not a learned tradition, not a studied one. The kind that lives in the body before the mind ever gets involved. And when those same analysts turn to the early recordings of Jerry Lee Lewis, not the polished hits, but the raw Sun Sessions material, the stripped-back performances where nothing is hiding anything, the overlaps become difficult to dismiss. This is not simply a case of two people who grew up listening to the same music. Vocal quality at that level, that specific, that instinctive, that physically rooted, does not come from influence. It comes from blood. There's also the matter of how Jerry Lee Lewis responded when the private corners of his life were pushed into the light. Throughout his career, across dozens of interviews and biographical investigations, there were consistent patterns in the subjects he refused to engage with. He could laugh about the scandals, he could perform self-awareness about his marriages with a kind of theatrical ease. But questions about children he may not have publicly acknowledged, questions about the women in his life before his rise to fame, before the cameras were pointed at him, those questions produced a different response. A stillness that didn't match the rest of him. A deflection so practiced it had clearly been rehearsed across many years. Silence, in a man as loud as Jerry Lee Lewis, is never accidental. It is always a choice. And choices, over time, tell their own story. People who have spent years researching the genealogy of the Sun Records era, music historians, independent investigators, family researchers who work outside the mainstream press, have quietly raised these questions for longer than most people realize. They have noted the timeline. They have noted the geography. They have noted the vocal inheritance that seems to live in Bob Joyce's voice like a signature that was never meant to be found. None of them have had the platform to make these questions heard at the volume they deserve. And that is precisely why the story has stayed buried for as long as it has. But here is the thing about buried stories. They don't stay buried because they aren't true. They stay buried because the truth is inconvenient for the people with the power to control the narrative. Jerry Lee Lewis had that power. The music industry that protected his legacy had that power. And for decades, that power was enough. Then, walk the timeline forward. Place what we know about Bob Joyce's origins next to what we know about Jerry Lee Lewis's undocumented early years. Sit inside the geographic overlap. Listen to the voice. And then ask yourself, honestly, quietly, without the noise of the official story drowning everything out, whether this is really a coincidence. This wasn't just two men who shared a sound. This may have been a father and a son, separated by scandal, separated by shame, separated by a world that punished the truth and rewarded the silence that buried it. There is a particular kind of pain that has no name in the English language. It's the pain of growing up without knowing who you are, not in the philosophical sense, but in the most literal, biological sense. Not knowing whose blood runs through you. Not knowing which voice, which laugh, which particular way of holding a note came from someone who existed before you did and shaped you before you ever had a choice in the matter. It is a quiet pain, a foundational one. And if the connection between Bob Joyce and Jerry Lee Lewis is what the evidence suggests it might be, then that pain has been living inside this story for a very long time. Think about what that means for a moment. Really sit with it. If Bob Joyce carries Jerry Lee Lewis's bloodline, if that voice, that extraordinary era-defining, impossible-to-explain voice came from the most notorious hellraiser in the history of American music, then Bob Joyce grew up without that knowledge. He built his life, chose his faith, found his calling, and stood behind that pulpit Sunday after Sunday, without ever fully understanding why God gave him a sound that made strangers weep and stop cold and reach for their phones to share what they were hearing with everyone they knew. He lived inside a gift whose origin he may never have been told. And that is not a small thing. That is the kind of absence that quietly reshapes everything around it. And then there is Jerry Lee Lewis's side of the silence. In his final years, Lewis gave interviews that felt different from the ones that came before. The bravado was still there, it never fully left him, but underneath it was something heavier. Something that sat behind his eyes in a way that the younger version of him would never have allowed a camera to catch. He talked about regret in the elliptical way that men of his generation talked about regret, never naming it directly, always approaching it from an angle, always leaving the most important sentence unfinished. He talked about God with the urgency of a man who felt time compressing. He talked about his children, the ones the world knew, with a tenderness that surprised people who only knew him as the killer. But there were things he never talked about, doors he never opened, names he never said. And the men who carry secrets like that to the end, the men who choose silence over truth, when the truth involves another human being's entire sense of identity, they do not carry that weight lightly. Whatever Jerry Lee Lewis believed about God, about judgment, about what waited on the other side of a life lived as loudly and as recklessly as his, he believed it with the full force of a man who had grown up in a church that didn't deal in metaphors. The fire was real to him. And the accounting was real to him. And if Bob Joyce is who the evidence suggests he might be, then that accounting included a name that Jerry Lee Lewis never once said in public. And yet here we are, nearly 50 years later. And the question has not died. Think about what that actually means. Not as a conspiracy, not as a fantasy, but as a sociological fact. 50 years of access to information, 50 years of people motivated to find the truth, 50 years of journalism and research and internet investigation, and the question of whether Elvis Presley truly left this world on August 16th, 1977, remains genuinely, stubbornly, uncomfortably open in the minds of millions of people around the world. That is not what happens when the answer is obvious. That is what happens when something underneath the official story doesn't quite hold its shape under pressure. And into that 50-year silence, Bob Joyce's voice keeps arriving. Every Sunday. Unannounced, uninvited by the conversation, and yet perfectly placed inside it. Now consider what a definitive vocal forensic analysis would actually require. Not a side-by-side comparison made by passionate researchers working from publicly available recordings, but a true, commissioned, authoritative scientific analysis conducted by professionals with access to original master recordings, advanced spectral imaging technology, and the kind of institutional credibility that makes a finding mean something beyond the comment section of a YouTube video. That analysis has never been done. Not by Elvis Presley Enterprises, not by any major music publication, not by any academic institution with the resources and the reach to make it matter. The technology exists. The recordings exist. The question exists loudly enough to justify the effort. And yet, silence, no commission, no study, no official attempt to put the comparison to rest with the kind of evidence that would actually settle it. Ask yourself why. Not as a rhetorical exercise, genuinely. If the comparison is meaningless, if Bob Joyce is simply a gifted singer with a remarkable coincidental resemblance, and the whole conversation is a harmless curiosity that serious people should politely ignore, then the cost of proving that is almost nothing. A proper analysis would take weeks. It would produce a clear result. It would end the conversation permanently. And yet, nobody with the authority and the resources to commission it has ever done so. The absence of that denial is not proof of anything, but it is, as it has always been, profoundly interesting. What this story is really about, underneath the audio, underneath the timeline, underneath the questions that keep refusing to resolve, is legacy. It is about what it means for a voice of that magnitude to persist in the world. Elvis Presley's voice was not just a cultural product. It was a living thing. It moved people in ways that bypassed language and logic and landed somewhere older and deeper than either. It made people feel seen and known and understood in that specific way that only music can achieve. And when that voice disappeared from the world, when August 16th, 1977 became the date on the stone, something went out of the culture that has never fully been replaced. And then a preacher in Arkansas opened his mouth. And the sound came back. Whatever you believe about Bob Joyce, whatever conclusion your reason and your instinct arrive at together when you weigh everything you've heard today, that moment of return is real. The effect is real. The reaction in the bodies of the people who hear him is real. And the side-by-side audio comparison that brought you to this video today is real in the most specific, measurable, undeniable sense. Two voices, operating by the same internal logic, shaped by the same invisible architecture, carrying the same frequency into the same air. Go back and listen one more time. Not for the resemblance. You already heard that. Listen this time for what lives underneath the resemblance. Listen for the thing that doesn't have a name yet. The quality that made one analyst go quiet, that made grown adults cry in a church pew, that has kept this conversation alive for decades, when every other Elvis theory has long since faded. Listen for whatever it is that refuses to be explained, because that, right there, is where the truth is hiding. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The third element is harder to quantify but impossible to ignore once you've heard it, and that is the natural sustain on held notes. There is a quality in certain voices where, when they hold a note at full resonance, the sound doesn't just hang in the air, it seems to expand slightly before it releases, as though the voice has one final thing to say before it lets go. It is not a technique. Vocal coaches do not teach it. It emerges from a specific combination of lung capacity, laryngeal positioning, and something that researchers simply call resonant shape, the literal physical architecture of the throat, mouth, and nasal cavity working together in a way that is genetically determined. There is something almost unbearably poetic about the shape of this story. The man who defined devil's music, who was condemned from pulpits across America, who was told by preachers and parents and radio programmers that what he played was the sound of sin itself, may have fathered a son who devoted his entire life to gospel, to God, to the kind of music that stands in direct opposition to everything Jerry Lee Lewis was publicly celebrated for. Whether that happened by design or by accident, whether it was fate or coincidence or something in between, it is one of the most quietly devastating ironies in the entire history of American music. Jerry Lee Lewis is gone now. He died in October of 2022, and with him went the answers that only he could have confirmed. The paper trails of his early life remain thin. The women he knew before the cameras found him remain largely undocumented. And the children he may have fathered in those years, in that geography, in that era, in that window of time before the world was watching, may never receive the acknowledgement that would have cost him so little and meant everything to them. But the voice remains. Bob Joyce is still singing, still standing behind that pulpit in Arkansas, still carrying a sound that has no rational explanation for existing inside an ordinary life, unless the life was never quite as ordinary as it appeared. Jerry Lee Lewis shook the world with his music. He rattled stages and scandalized nations and permanently altered the DNA of American rock and roll. But the most powerful thing he ever created may have been the one thing he never once took credit for. If this story moved you, don't let it disappear into the algorithm. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe, because the stories we cover here go deeper than anywhere else. There is so much more still to uncover. Don't miss it.